Just curious, what device are you watching on? Phone, TV, laptop? Comment below.
When my mom said, "It's a celebration for achievers," I smiled and said I understood. But the kind of understanding I gave her wasn't the sort that softens a blow or makes things easier to swallow. It was the kind of understanding that burns low and quiet. The kind that doesn't ask follow-up questions because it already knows the answers, even the ones nobody dares say out loud. I don't think she meant to twist the knife quite so elegantly, although if I'm honest, maybe she did. My family has a talent for passive cruelty, the sort you can't exactly pin down in a courtroom, but still feels like an emotional mugging. The email had been short, curt, practically an afterthought. "We're hosting a little celebration for the achievers in the family, those who made us proud this year. Hope you understand." That last part was the most polished dagger of all. Hope you understand. What was I supposed to understand exactly? That I didn't make the cut? That despite surviving another year of building something from nothing, despite doing more than anyone thought I could with far less than anyone ever offered, I somehow didn't qualify for a night of buffet shrimp, cheap champagne, and hollow compliments? I stared at that email longer than I should have, rereading it while my coffee went cold, wondering if this was finally the moment they'd stop pretending I was one of them. I mean, they've always liked the version of me that smiled in group photos and stayed quiet while the real conversations happened in other rooms. They could handle the surface-level small talk, the updates about my little project, which is how they referred to my company, as though I were operating a lemonade stand out of a garage instead of pitching investors in boardrooms I had no business being in. It was never said aloud, but it hung in the air. I wasn't respectable. I wasn't a doctor like my cousin Jared, or a finance VP like my sister Danielle, who never missed a chance to remind me that her promotion came with a reserved parking spot and a corporate credit card. I wasn't even married, which in my family is still considered a benchmark for maturity, as if securing a husband is some kind of diploma. They call themselves supportive, but that word loses all meaning when it comes out of mouths that won't say your name in the same sentence as the word pride. They like results, polished resumes, LinkedIn posts that can be bragged about over wine at country club dinners. And I was still working out of a co-working space that smelled like printer ink and desperation, still wearing the same boots I bought 3 years ago, still eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner 3 nights a week to make rent and payroll happen at the same time. But I wasn't failing. That's the part they never seem to grasp. It's just that my timeline didn't match theirs. I wasn't climbing a corporate ladder. I was trying to build the damn building. And it turns out that people who've never had to build anything from scratch, people who've had safety nets and introductions and trust funds that paid for their grad school, rarely have the patience to understand those of us who start from zero, with nothing but caffeine and whatever self-belief hasn't been kicked out of us yet. Still, despite everything, I debated going. I even looked up a dress online, the kind that says, "I'm successful," without screaming it, the kind with clean lines and a price tag that made my stomach twist. But then I remembered, I wasn't invited. Not really. The guest list was shared in a group chat I wasn't on, but my cousin Aaron had sent me a screenshot by accident. My name wasn't there. Jared was, Danielle was. Even Patrick, the one who quit law school to pursue mindfulness consulting, whatever the hell that is. But me, the one who spent Christmas Eve last year fixing a server bug so a client's e-commerce platform wouldn't crash during holiday sales. Nowhere to be found. So I sat at my kitchen table, staring at that email, wondering what kind of woman gets deliberately left off a family guest list, while everyone she grew up with clinks glasses and takes selfies under gold-lettered banners that say, "Congrats, legends." And I knew in the cold and quiet part of my gut that this wasn't about an oversight or a mistake, or even a difference in values. This was about erasure. They decided somewhere along the way that I didn't count, that until I showed up with something undeniable, something they could understand and post about with glee, I would remain the relative they avoided talking about, the one who chose the unconventional path, and was now paying the price for it in the currency of exclusion. I didn't cry, I didn't yell, I didn't even write back. I just closed my laptop, walked to the fridge, and pulled out the last can of off-brand cola I'd been saving. It was flat, warm, and tasted like defeat. But I drank it anyway, because what else do you do when your own family tells you, without ever saying the words, that you're invisible? I washed the mug, folded the towel, and made a vow. Not the dramatic movie kind, not the I'll show them kind that fades with the first good night's sleep. This was quieter, sharper, meaner. I told myself I'd never ask them to see me again. If they ever did, it would be because they couldn't help it. Because the world would scream my name loud enough to drown out their silence. And when that moment came, I wouldn't need an invitation. There's something grotesquely poetic about building your life from scratch, while everyone you know seems to be handed theirs like party favors at a graduation banquet. And I don't say that with bitterness or envy exactly, though both have curled up beside me like stray dogs on nights I couldn't afford dinner and pretended half a granola bar was enough to sleep on. I say it with the weary familiarity of someone who has lived the kind of slow, grinding ascent no one ever claps for until it becomes impossible to ignore. The truth is, I didn't plan for any of this. I didn't sketch out a master strategy or read a dozen self-help books that mapped out the hero's journey with perfect Pinterest clarity. It started because I had an idea that wouldn't leave me alone. An irritation lodged in the back of my brain like a splinter under skin. And no matter how many times I told myself to be realistic, to focus on getting a real job. Like my sister constantly advised with her sideways glances and weaponized concern, I couldn't kill the thought that maybe, just maybe, I could build something that didn't need to beg for validation at Thanksgiving dinners. The early months weren't romantic or cinematic. There were no montages, no breakthroughs lit by golden sunlight. Just the mundane terror of not knowing if I could stretch my rent another month or if my laptop would crash before I finished the prototype that was held together with more stubbornness than code. I worked from my tiny studio apartment that never seemed to warm up no matter how high I turned the heat, the kind of place that had one good corner for natural light and a perpetual smell of damp carpet from a leak no one ever fixed. I sat on the floor most days, not because I liked it, but because I didn't own a chair, eating discount store noodles from the pot and coding until my wrists ached and my eyes blurred into pixels. There were moments I questioned everything, nights when my bank account balance blinked zeros back at me like a cruel joke, days when potential investors said things like, "Come back when you have traction," which I quickly realized was Silicon Valley speak for, "We don't believe in you." But each rejection became a layer of callous. And over time, I stopped needing permission to believe in my own momentum. Still, it's not as if I was entirely alone, at least not at first. For a while, I had Sam, a guy I'd met during a weekend coding boot camp who believed in the dream just enough to help me build the beta version. He had that startup glint in his eye, the kind that makes people trade steady paychecks for 20-hour workdays and an endless loop of ramen and whiteboards. But dreams cost different things for different people. And when his girlfriend gave him the ultimatum, her or the late nights, her or the missed birthdays, her or the maybe someday payoff, he chose the one who didn't live in his Google Docs. I didn't blame him, I just kept going. It was around that time that I hit what I now call the frozen dinner phase, a 3-month stretch where my meals consisted entirely of whatever was on clearance in the grocery store's dying freezer section. And my only luxury was the occasional bag of store-brand kettle chips I let myself have on Fridays, which I pretended was a celebration even when I felt like I was one bad week away from calling my parents and pretending to ask for advice just so I could get a check slipped into my mailbox. But I never made that call. Pride is a terrible dinner companion, but it was all I had. Ironically, what pushed me hardest wasn't failure. It was my sister Danielle's LinkedIn post. She had shared an article titled, "Why Some People Just Aren't Meant to Lead," accompanied by a paragraph about how leadership was about stability, credibility, and being respected in the boardroom. And although she didn't mention me by name, she didn't need to. The subtext roared loud enough to peel paint off the walls. That was the moment I realized I didn't just want to succeed. I wanted to do it so unapologetically that even she would have to choke on her carefully curated language. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about revenge, not really. It was about being undeniable. The real twist, though, the one I never told anyone, not even Sam when he briefly reappeared months later to say congrats and ask if I needed a tech advisor, was that my idea hadn't always been mine. At least, not in the way people like to define originality. When I was 22, fresh out of a state college and still unsure of how to even spell venture capital, I shared the concept with Danielle over coffee, sketching it out on a napkin in the back corner of a chain cafe, while she scrolled through her phone and nodded distractedly. She called it idealistic and warned me to start smaller. But 6 months later, she pitched something eerily similar at her firm's innovation panel. She claimed it was just coincidence, and maybe it was, or maybe she had absorbed it in passing and convinced herself it was hers. People like her are excellent at accidental theft. Either way, her version flopped. No market fit, no grit behind the curtain, just an executive summary and a graphic designer on retainer. It failed because it didn't come from that part of yourself that can't sleep unless it's built. I didn't confront her. I let the idea come back to me like a boomerang, slightly bruised but still whole, and I nurtured it in silence while she moved on to her next initiative, her next award, her next cocktail party introduction where she got to say she was consulting on disruptive tech without ever opening a terminal window. So when people talk about the courage it takes to be an entrepreneur, I don't think about pitch decks or networking events or carefully selected buzzwords. I think about eating lentils off paper towels in a dark kitchen and telling yourself for the 1,000th time that you're not crazy, that this will work, that your voice is worth something even if no one is listening yet. Because sometimes building alone isn't a flaw. It's the only way you make sure the thing that emerges is truly yours. And someday, when the noise finally catches up, you'll remember every frozen dinner, every overdraft fee, every email left on. Read by people who now claim they always knew you had it in you. And maybe you'll smile. Or maybe, like me, you'll just keep moving, quiet, sharp, focused, planning for the next thing they'll pretend they supported. There's a particular kind of ache that comes not from being forgotten, but from being deliberately omitted. Like someone took the time to remember you just long enough to erase you with precision. And when I opened the group email from my mother, subject line cheerful and smug, big night for the big names. I knew before I read a single word that whatever was in yin wasn't meant for me, not in presence, not in spirit, and certainly not in the kind of familial pride that most daughters receive as a birthright rather than something to be earned like a sales bonus. The email, formatted with bold fonts and embedded photos, read like a press release for people who had never once been questioned at TSA, the kind of smiling celebration of other people's children that my parents specialized in when they needed to broadcast their value by association. So thrilled to host this Saturday's dinner, celebrating Danielle's nomination to VP of Strategy, Jared's published research in the Journal of Advanced Cardiology, and Patrick's launch of his second mindfulness retreat in Sedona, this time fully booked by week 2. The words felt like they were shouting at me from across a polished, manicured lawn, while I stood barefoot in gravel, holding my breath. What stung more than the contents was the silence that followed it, the complete absence of my name, my work, my company, nothing. No mention, not even a hollow phrase like, and to all doing great things in their own way, which families sometimes use as a catch-all for the unremarkables, for those they don't understand but are still required to acknowledge. It was as if I had never existed, or worse, as if I had been reviewed and found lacking, quietly excised like a bad credit score from a joint application. I sat there frozen in my chair, rereading the email while the rest of the world moved around me. Cars passed outside. My upstairs neighbor's dog barked in sharp rhythmic barks like a metronome, and the radiator hissed in a useless attempt to heat the corners of my drafty apartment. But all I could hear was the thunderous absence of belonging. That dinner wasn't a celebration of success. It was an inventory of worthiness, and the list had been finalized without my name. I didn't cry, at least not in the obvious movie scene way people cry when they're betrayed or heartbroken. I just felt a slow unraveling behind my ribs, like someone had pulled one loose thread, and now my entire interior was coming undone without sound or spectacle. The ache wasn't sharp, it was dull, patient, the kind of pain you carry for years without realizing how much it's reshaped your spine, until one day you look in the mirror and your posture tells the whole story. The thing that made it worse, if there was anything worse, was that I knew this was intentional, not malicious in the cartoon villain sense, but calculated, curated, like a family brand strategy that decided which of its extensions deserved to be showcased and which ones quietly phased out. Danielle had always been the golden child. Her LinkedIn profile read like a Fortune 500 fairy tale, her apartment featured in some design blog once, and she never failed to remind people that she had gone IV, unlike me. Jared was the steady one, unshakable and safe, beloved by every grandparent and employer alike. Patrick, despite his erratic life choices and vague career pivots, had somehow mastered the art of failing upward, his charm and insurance policy that I, apparently, had never qualified for. I used to believe that merit would eventually force their hand, that if I worked hard enough, if I built something unignorable, if I held on long enough while others quit, they would have no choice but to fold me into the narrative they were so quick to offer everyone else. But that night, as I stared at that email and the RSVP button I would never click, I realized that my absence wasn't an oversight. It was a decision. A quiet, rehearsed, damning decision. The part that gutted me the most wasn't even about me. It was the realization that, if I ever had children, they would grow up knowing that part of their mother's story was one of exclusion by her own blood. And they might ask someday, why didn't they invite you? And I'd have to find a way to explain that not all rejection comes in loud, dramatic gestures. Sometimes it's clean, efficient, and wears the mask of celebration. Later that evening, after pacing through my apartment like a ghost caught in a loop, I sat down and began drafting what would become the final pitch deck for the deal I'd been chasing for nearly 2 years. I worked through the night, the kind of obsessive, hungry work that isn't noble or glamorous. It's just necessary. My fingers cramped. My eyes burned. But something inside me had clicked into place with a kind of fatal clarity. I wasn't going to chase their approval anymore. I wasn't going to wait for an invitation that would never come. I would become undeniable, not for them, but in spite of them. Because the thing about being left out is that it builds a fire under you, the kind that doesn't burn hot or wild, but slow and deep, the kind that doesn't need oxygen from anyone else because it makes its own. I didn't know it yet, but that email, the one that confirmed my exclusion with polite punctuation, had just lit the last match. And while they were printing menus and arranging centerpieces for a dinner party filled with names and accolades they could admire and discuss like trophies, I was quietly preparing the kind of announcement that would make even their curated social media feeds pause in confusion, then awe, then panic. But for now, I let the silence settle. I closed the email. I put on a coat. I stepped outside and walked until the cold numbed my face and the sting in my chest dulled into a promise. They wanted a guest list. I was building the guest list of a lifetime. They just didn't know it yet. There was something strangely comforting about the ritual I had fallen into on nights like this, the ones that followed a silent humiliation so well practiced that it no longer felt like an ambush, but rather a scheduled appointment with disappointment, the kind you dress down for because you already know you won't be staying long. So when Saturday evening finally rolled around and my phone began buzzing with the subtle choreography of group texts I wasn't part of, Instagram stories I wasn't tagged in, and smiling faces I didn't want to see but couldn't help staring at, I let it all wash over me in the same way you might stare out at the rain from behind a window you've already sealed shut. I didn't cook, because cooking still felt like something reserved for celebrations or people who were being witnessed. And I wasn't either of those things tonight, so instead I pulled a plastic container of Thai noodles from the back of the fridge, the kind I had ordered 3 days ago in a brief fit of ambition when I thought I might reward myself, after finishing a client call that went better than expected. But the call never happened, rescheduled again, and the noodles had become a symbol of everything I was too tired to fight for. I microwaved them on high until the edges burned and the center stayed lukewarm, a metaphor too obvious to even laugh at, and sat down in my usual corner with my laptop open, not because I had work to do, but because the blue light had replaced the need for ambient company. Outside, the city was alive with its usual Saturday confidence, laughter bouncing off concrete, couples arguing playfully on their way to overpriced dinners, and the distant sound of someone trying to start a car that didn't want to be started. Inside, my apartment hummed with the soft menace of fluorescent lighting and the low thrum of a radiator, too old to be trusted. And yet it was the safest place I knew. There was a silence here that wasn't empty. It was earned. I had poured every version of myself into this space, shed my doubts like snakeskin on its floors, and while it wasn't warm, it was mine, which was more than I could say about the seat that had been left vacant for me at my parents' dinner table, though we both knew they'd never admit it existed. I watched the time tick by slowly, a kind of reverse countdown to nothing. 7:15, 7:50, 8:03. I imagined them raising glasses to each other, Danielle standing in the center of it all with her glossed smile and easy success, the family clapping in that polite, performative way that makes it clear they've already assigned value to everyone in the room. And I wondered briefly if anyone would mention me, maybe as a kind of footnote or cautionary tale. Probably not. I was inconvenient to the narrative, too scrappy, too unknown, too unwilling to play the part of the quietly failing sibling who needed rescuing. I had just finished forcing down the last bite of cold noodles when the pop-up flashed across the top right of my laptop screen, the kind that usually announces weather alerts or software updates. But this one bore the unmistakable colors of CNBC, and for a moment I ignored it, assuming it was just another financial bulletin I had forgotten to unsubscribe from, until I caught my own name in bold letters and stopped breathing. There it was, my face, slightly outdated but still recognizable, paired with the headline, "Early Stage Startup Lands 9-Figure Acquisition Deal with Unnamed Tech Giant. Founder Calls it Phase 1. And beneath it, a link to the full story, which I clicked with the kind of mechanical disbelief normally reserved for people being read their own obituaries. The article was short, clipped, and riddled with speculative language, but there was no mistaking the core of it. The deal I had been negotiating in secret, across late-night Zoom calls and confidential NDAs, the one I hadn't even dared to believe in fully until the wire transfer cleared, had just gone public. For a long moment, I didn't move. The noodles were congealing beside me. The light from the screen made the room look colder than it already was, and my hands hovered above the keyboard as though waiting for some kind of instruction from a director who had just forgotten their own script. I should have felt triumph, elation, something cinematic and sharp, but instead I felt this immense, cavernous stillness, as if the world had tilted, and I was the only one who had noticed. It wasn't joy, it wasn't relief, it was power, quiet, absolute, and terrifying in its finality. I closed the article and opened my inbox, which was already beginning to swell with press inquiries, congratulatory emails from contacts I hadn't heard from in years, and a few vague, grasping messages from investors who had passed on my seed round and were now trying to reconnect under the guise of touching base. My phone lit up next, vibrating across the table in a slow, almost apologetic hum, as if even it knew it had failed to alert me sooner. There were texts from colleagues, a call from Sam, of course, and 3 messages from LinkedIn congratulating me on being mentioned in news articles that were now trending. Still, I said nothing. I didn't call anyone. I didn't post. I didn't scream or jump or dance in my kitchen, like some cheap motivational montage. I sat there in silence, letting the knowledge settle into the bones of the woman I had become, the one who had eaten failure like it was a food group, who had written code with fingers that shook from exhaustion, who had stood outside investor meetings rehearsing pitches to bathroom mirrors because no one ever offered her a mentor. This wasn't the beginning of something. This was the middle of a promise I had made to myself in a much smaller, lonelier moment, when I had nothing and no one, and dared to believe that maybe one day the noise would find me. And now it had. But I wasn't going to answer just yet. Not tonight, because while they toasted each other under string lights and posed for photos destined to clutter my mother's fridge, I was planning something else. Not louder, not flashier, but surgical, precise, and inevitable. They thought I wasn't invited. They hadn't realized the party was about to move. It's a strange thing, really, to hold in your hands the very thing you once begged for in silence. The recognition, the leverage, the right to speak without being interrupted or corrected or dismissed. And to find that, when it finally arrives, it doesn't roar like thunder or explode like fireworks, but instead settles quietly across your shoulders like an old, familiar coat. One that fits perfectly, not because it was tailored, but because you've grown into it while no one was watching. That's how it felt, sitting in front of my laptop the morning after the CNBC alert dropped, my inbox vibrating with a pulse of attention so intense it could have powered a city block, while the apartment around me remained unchanged. Same peeling paint near the windowsill, same cluttered table, same half-drunk coffee that had gone cold while I was still processing the sheer volume of emails, messages, and congratulations that hadn't existed just 12 hours earlier. The air carried that unique stillness that only follows a private victory, the kind no one else hears but you, and as the sun clawed its way across the skyline, casting long shadows through the blinds and onto my hardwood floor, I opened the family group thread, the one I had been removed from months ago but still had access to through an old Gmail alias they had forgotten I ever used. I stared at the latest message, sent at exactly midnight by my mother, a photo of Danielle raising a glass at the dinner table, surrounded by clapping hands and wine-stained teeth. The caption reading, "So proud of our legends, what a night," followed by a string of well-worn affirmations from various cousins, aunts, and sycophants, each one more eager than the last, to validate the hierarchy that had been established long before any of us had the vocabulary to challenge it. I read the messages slowly, not because they hurt, but because I wanted to absorb them fully, to memorize the cadence of their confidence, the way they moved around each other like satellites locked in a gravitational pull too ancient to break. And then, with a stillness so deliberate it felt like prayer, I began to write. It wasn't long, just 3 sentences, written not in anger or triumph, but in the clear, even tone of someone who had spent years sharpening her voice into a scalpel rather than a sword. I attached a screenshot of the CNBC article, the one with my face, and the headline announcing the acquisition, along with a clipped quote from the investor I had once cold emailed on a whim, now praising my leadership and vision in a sentence so poetic it could have passed for fiction. And beneath it I typed, "Didn't see my name on the guest list. Thought this might help next time. Hope you understand." Then I hit reply all. For a moment nothing happened. The cursor blinked with that maddening regularity, indifferent to the tectonic shift it had just triggered. And then slowly, responses began to trickle in. First from a distant cousin who sent nothing but a string of question marks, then from an uncle who hadn't spoken to me in years, but suddenly remembered how to spell my name correctly, followed by a flurry of quiet acknowledgments, feigned confusion, and the digital equivalent of nervous laughter. Danielle didn't reply. Not at first. Her silence felt intentional, a strategic delay meant to regain control of the narrative, to craft a message that wouldn't betray the sharp sting I knew she was feeling. When it finally came, hours later, it was everything I expected. Polished, patronizing, and dripping with the kind of saccharine composure that only the deeply wounded know how to wield. "Wow, this is incredible news," she wrote. "We're all so proud of you. Can't wait to celebrate together soon." As if nothing had happened. As if the past 10 years of subtle sabotage, public silence, and private condescension could be erased with an exclamation mark. I didn't respond, because that was never the point. The point wasn't to gloat or to finally sit at their table or to reclaim some imagined seat in a family that had always treated belonging like a game of musical chairs, where I was handed the wrong sheet music. The point was to end the performance, to burn down the set and walk off stage without waiting for applause, to remind them, and maybe myself, that my value had never depended on their recognition, their validation, or their presence. I closed the thread, archived the emails, and turned off my phone, letting the world keep spinning without me for a while. That night, I sat on my rooftop alone, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the wind, and sipping a glass of something far better than the off-brand cola I had once toasted with in defeat. The city buzzed beneath me, unaware of the quiet war that had just ended, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was chasing anything. There was no race, no performance, no need to be seen by those who had trained themselves to look away. There was just space and air and the steady thrum of my own pulse reminding me that I had survived not just their indifference, but the quieter violence of erasure. In the months that followed, the congratulations continued, most of them hollow, performative, transactional, people wanting to reconnect, to grab coffee, to pick my brain, now that it had become valuable. I answered few. I ignored most. And when my mother finally called, 3 weeks after the deal had made the front page of the Times, she didn't mention the dinner. She didn't mention the email. She just asked how I was doing, her voice brittle with the weight of everything she couldn't say, and I told her I was fine, because I was. Not happy, not content, but fine in the way that only someone who has learned to build themselves from rejection can be. Fine in the way that endures, that refuses to shrink, that knows its own shape. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real revenge. Not the reply, not the headline, not the sudden flood of attention, but the quiet, immovable truth that I no longer needed any of them to know exactly who I was.